scholars, and welcome back. Today we're just going to do a quick video about the differences between Greek and Roman sculpture. How to be able to tell the difference between archaic, or the most ancient form of Greek sculpture that we're studying in this particular class, and then classical period, Hellenistic period, and then the Romans were such huge super fans of Greek sculpture, it's very difficult to tell the difference because they did a lot of replicas, they did a lot of copies, but there's still a few things that we can say about Roman sculpture that make it different from its Greek predecessors. So let's jump in. First, we have the Archaic period. And we've talked about this a couple of times already, but remember the archaic smile, the giant eyes, they're almost sort of cartoon-like, and that unblinking, unmoving, unchanging, we are obsessed with youth and beauty and that sort of static forever that is these early quarry sculptures. And I added this one of the painted piece because I just wanted to remind everyone that all of our Greek sculptures were painted. They would have been heavily decorated. And that's one key thing that we're getting into with the Greek sculptures. There's never a carved in iris because that would have been the painter's job, not the sculptor's job. Whereas with the Roman sculptures, sometimes we have that, but we'll get to that in a minute. So remember that everything that we're looking at today would have been painted. And you've got that very stiff posture. You have the very sort of cartoon-like, exaggerated facial features with the big eyes, the silly cartoon, archaic smile lips. And they're very stylized because they're not meant to be realistic. Perhaps we hadn't gotten there yet. I've heard that argument before, but I think for these early pieces, we are looking more for an idea, not necessarily an ideal, but an idea of youth and beauty and the human form. As we get into classical period, I would say this is when we hit ideal, where we've got just that very realistic, but perfect. So while these probably look more like real people than the archaic versions, they are still idealized. They're almost never going to look exactly like a real person. So I selected two sculptures of gods today just to kind of drive home that idea of unrealistic expectations of perfection in our idealized realism. So we've got contrapposto pose for our goddess there. So she's got all of her weight on one foot, tilting that hip upwards a little bit. So we're starting to get more naturalistic poses, but they're a bit stiff. And I think the difference is, can you tell the difference when, say, there's a photograph of somebody when they're just naturally moving and they get captured in a photograph versus sort of like having to be in a figure drawing class and you're the model, so you have to hold a pose for 20 minutes or something. It's going to have like this fixed stiffness to the pose, even if it is a real person. So I think the classical style, while they are very realistic, very naturalistic, you're going to get that idealized beauty in both the body, figure form, and the face. And you're also going to be getting that like studio pose kind of poses out of them where there's just a certain stiffness about the natural postures. As we get into the Hellenistic period, this is, I think, where everybody knows as many sculptures as they know because these are the ones that the Romans were obsessed with, the Renaissance, sort of 1,000 years later, were obsessed with, and that we still find beautiful. And I just grabbed one quickly because we look at so many others in other lectures, and I want to keep this one short, that it's where we finally get that really, really emotional, natural. You can get that movement, that energy, that life. And so I think with the Hellenistic period, we are getting to that pinnacle of real movement and energy and life. Whereas the quarry, way back in our archaic period, there's nothing lifelike about them. I don't think they're even supposed to feel like they're alive at all. With the classical period, you've got that stiffness but more naturalism, and finally with the Hellenistic period we get that life, that energy, that movement. What we can take from naturalism and realism even further, now we move into the Roman period. The Romans copied the living beeswax out of all of our Greek statues. So Discobolus and a couple of those more famous ones that we have. There's so many Discobolus sculptures. I didn't pick one for this because we've got so many copies. And my issue with having to make my own video here today is because when I'm looking at other videos online about telling the difference between Roman and Greek sculptures, oftentimes the examples for the Greek sculptures are still Roman copies of the Greek sculptures. And that's cheating. Especially if we're missing the original Greek sculpture and they say, no, it's an exact Roman replica of a lost sculpture. I need to see some receipts. I don't believe you. So as we move into the Romans, there's going to be a lot of just perhaps identical replica copies of earlier Greek sculptures. But then we sort of get these two movements that are uniquely Roman. And the Hellenistic period, we get that energy, that life, that realism. The Roman Republican period, and remember the Republican period was the democracy-ish. I mean, democracy is Greek, but this is when you had your elected officials, res publica, like of the people, matters of the people. So this is when you have your representatives, and honestly, it's very political. I think that they went for this super realism. Some people call this the warts and all style because they had every wrinkle, every scar, every pockmark, every wart, because they wanted to give you that idea that they weren't hiding anything. This was really them. They were being completely transparent and honest. They weren't trying to sort of Facetune, filter, hide things, make things look better than they actually are. And you can see that those are all very sort of political statements to make as well. If I'm going to show you myself, warts and all, honestly, in a sculpture, I'm also representing what I'm doing for you in government, warts and all, very transparent, very honest. I'm a man of the people. So to me, during this elected official time, when you want to know what your government agents are up to, you want that transparency. You want to feel like you know what's happening because you asked them to be there, right? If they're representing the people need to know what exactly it is that's being represented. And so the Republican era for the Romans is this like extreme realism, like the warts and all movement. But I love it because I feel like you can tell exactly what these guys look like. And also notice we went from archaic and classical era, we're sort of worshiping youth and beauty and this ideal. And an ideal is you're when you're young, not when you're old. We sort of had that youth worship happening. In the Republican era, we are valuing as a culture age and wisdom. So you've got knowledge and wisdom, and that comes with time and study and experience. So the older you are, the more wrinkles you have, the less hair you have, the more you've seen in this world. And we are respecting that experience. And as I mentioned earlier, I grabbed these two busts of one of them is a emperor and one of them is a god, Hercules, demigod, close enough. But they both have that carved in pupil iris section. So perhaps these were not painted. That whole idea of, if you look at the ones previous, nobody had irises. So these are Roman. They didn't have that carved in eyeball structure. But I guarantee you, if it has the carved in eyeball structure, it is definitely Roman. It is not Greek. But if it doesn't mean that it's Greek. It just means it could be either one. All right. Then finally moving, and I just kind of spoiled it, the emperor there, we're moving into imperial Rome. So the imperial sculpture, and I just kind of did remind you that those were still painted. We had centuries and centuries of all the paint. as we get into the imperial period, we are going to be sort of mixing these ideas. So classical Greece, we had that idealized. So the gods are perfect and they're forever young, no matter eternal. And so you don't necessarily want, if you have this absolute authority of an emperor that you did not elect and he's just there and he's in charge until he dies, he needs to sort of be more than just a representative of the people. He needs to be a larger than life figure. And also, a bit like with monarchies that we've had all throughout history, all over the world, the health of the monarch is very much kind of an equivalency to the health of the nation. So you don't want to be afraid that your monarch's going to die, because then you're going to have that transition period again, and those are never fun, or at least usually. I think we just had one in England recently and it went pretty smooth for the most part. Yeah. So when you've got a unelected for life head of your government, like a king or an emperor, he needs to sort of have that foreverness. You don't want to see him old and wrinkly and about to keel over. That's scary. So we got away from that Republican warts and all style, and we start almost going into this propaganda, make them look like the gods, in that sense of idealized strength, and they represent all these ideas rather than just a portrait of the person. So here we have, the military gear and these sort of perfect chiseled face and body. And so you're starting to get that younger, all put together, healthy, strong, ripped idea of what your emperor represents, more so than perhaps what he looks like today. And an interesting thing that has been noted, if you are, say, in the Roman Empire and you're out in the recently conquered colonial areas, your statues of the emperor are usually going to be in this kind of military garb because he's strong and he's a little bit scary. So, welcome to the empire, please stay in line. Versus when you're home in Rome or the sort of center of the empire, you're going to be getting more of those robes of philosophers and scholars and senators and terribly reasonable, learned people. So which angle of an idea is being represented depends on the place. And so he starts to represent more than just being a person. And we see it as we move into some of these colossi. I love this one because it doesn't look necessarily like the archaic period of Greece, but we're getting back to that idealized, immortal kind of look, to the point where look at how giant those eyes are. Yes, this is definitely not an archaic ancient piece. Everything's ancient that we're talking about today, but comparatively, this Roman imperial propaganda is still going back to that way that we used to style that foreverness, that unchangingness, that idealized almost to the point of being unrealistic. And now we're getting back to those cartoon features in this Colossus. And so you can see kind of not just how the art styles changed and then kind of swing back and forth in the pendulum, but also what they represent for cultural values and priorities. Not that all art is propaganda, but it is often a serious reflection of what we're up to in the culture at the time. So those are our main ways that you can tell the difference, because Greece did not have this republic imperial massive shift that the Roman history had. So they didn't have quite that same political reasoning for their art styles to take such a drastic change. But you can see with the Roman that we've got a lot of that inspiration from the different Greek eras. And so we're still big super fans of them, but we're using those different elements of the different Greek styles for our own cultural purposes in the Roman era.